Good evening and thank you for joining us. My name is Chrissy and I would like to welcome you to the Doylestown Bookshop's virtual event series. We are thrilled to welcome New York Times bestselling author Kate Moore as she discusses her newest book, The Woman They Could Not Silence, a dark and dramatic but ultimately uplifting tale of a forgotten woman whose inspirational journey sparked a lasting change for women's rights and exposed injustices. Kate will discuss her book for about 30 minutes. After that, she will take questions from you, the viewers. If you would like to submit a question, please click on Ask a Question on your screen and enter your question there. If you're on a phone or tablet, click the icon with the question mark to submit your questions. If you would like to purchase The Woman They Could Not Silence from the Doylestown or Lahaska bookshops, click the button on your screen that says Buy the Book. We have convenient curbside pickup at both of our stores and ship worldwide. Now, a little bit about our guest. Kate Moore is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of The Radium Girls, which won the 2017 Goodreads Choice Awards for Best History, was voted U.S. Librarian's Favorite Nonfiction Book of 2017, and was named a Notable Nonfiction Book of 2018 by the American Library Association. A British writer based in London, Kate writes across a variety of genres and has had multiple titles on the Sunday Times bestseller list. Good evening, Kate. It's a late evening for you, and thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And in pre-pandemic times, I actually was able to come and visit you in Doylestown. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully the next time we meet, it will be in person again. But
Oh, I
it's
hope so.
so amazing to be here. So thank you. Yeah, from midnight in the
Oh, my
UK.
goodness.
I'm really excited to be here. So thank you for having me. And I'm also excited to talk to you about my new book, The Woman They Could Not Silence.
Yes.
And our format for this evening is I'm going to kick off shortly with an edited extract from chapter one. I'm going to do a short reading from the book. And then I'll do a presentation about Elizabeth. And then at the end, we're going to do a Q&A. So if you do have any questions, I think they put them in the chat box. Is that right?
Well, they can click on Ask a Question, and they can type their questions in there. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, well, without
All
further
right.
ado,
I'll hand it off to
uh,
you.
thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to the woman they could not silence. Her name was Elizabeth Packard, and I suspect that many of you have never heard her name before because, as often happens to feisty women who stand up for themselves, her legacy has been forgotten by history. History commemorates instead the men who tried but failed to silence her. Now, Elizabeth's story starts on the cusp of the American Civil War. And it starts with Elizabeth, a 43-year-old housewife and mother of six, lying in bed in her marital home. And it starts with a simple question. What would happen if your husband could commit you to an insane asylum just because you disagreed with him? That's what happens to Elizabeth. And I'm excited to introduce you to her story. This woman was incredible, perhaps the most resilient and fearless woman I have ever encountered. She was a 5'1" Wonder Woman, a woman, if you can picture her, with long dark hair, brown almond shaped eyes, and a nose as strong and straight as her principles. And Elizabeth's downfall and her salvation came about because of one thing and one thing only. Elizabeth had a mind of her own. And at this juncture, I'm going to turn to the reading and start reading from the book. Before I begin, I do just want to make the point that this is a history book. It is all non-fiction. I hope that you'll see as I do the reading that, as you might know if you've read the Radium Girls, as a writer, I'm very much a storyteller. Even though I'm writing history books, I hope that they actually read almost like fiction. I hope that the characters seem vibrant. I hope I set scenes for you. I bring this history to life as though it's sort of happening in the here and now. But I want you to remember, even as you're swept up in the story, hopefully, that this is nonfiction. Every quotation in the book, every line of dialogue, it comes from an authentic historical resource, a record made by someone who was present at the time, a memoir, a letter, a trial transcript, a court document. And so everything in the book is true. And I do think it is important to remember that, because sometimes in this story, it feels like the truth is stranger than fiction, and it's important to remember that actually everything in it is true. So without further ado, let's begin. This is from chapter 1 of The Woman They Could Not Silence. The date is June 18th, 1860, and our setting is a little town called Manteno in Illinois. It was the last day, but she didn't know it. In truth, we never do, not until it is too late. She woke in a handsome maple bed, body covered by a snow-white counterpane. As her senses resurfaced after a restless night's sleep, Elizabeth Packard's brown eyes blearily mapped the landmarks of her room: embroidered ottoman, mahogany bureau, and smart green shutters that, for some reason, were failing to let in any light. Ordinarily, her husband of 21 years, Theophilus, a preacher, would have been snoring next to her, his gravity-defying curly red hair an impromptu pillow beneath his head. But a few long weeks before, he'd abandoned their marital bed. He thought it best, or so he'd said, to sleep alone these days. Instead, her senses were filled by the precious proximity of her slumbering 6-year-old son. Her children were truly the sun, moon, and stars to Elizabeth. To see their happy faces and laughing eyes offered such blessed light. It was particularly welcome in a world that was becoming, by the day, increasingly black. Such melancholy thoughts were uncharacteristic for Elizabeth. In normal times, the 43-year-old was always rejoicing. But the splits that were even now threatening her country, with some forecasting an all-out civil war, were mirrored in her small domestic sphere within her neat 2-story home. Over the past 4 months, she and her husband had retreated behind those enemy lines, prompting much anxious foreboding from Elizabeth. The Packards had married in 1839, when Elizabeth was a green 22 and Theophilus a dusty 37. At first, all had seemed well. Elizabeth had been raised to be a silent listener, and her preacher husband contentedly became the sole mouthpiece in their marriage. To make him happy was the height of my ambition, Elizabeth wrote. That's all I wanted, to make my husband shine inside and out. The problem in their marriage had been he didn't make her shine in return. Their characters were as opposite as it was possible to get. Where Elizabeth was vibrant, sociable, and curious, Theophilus was gloomy, timorous, and, in his own words, dull. Elizabeth described their marriage as cheerless. Nevertheless, she said nothing to him directly. That is, until everything changed. In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, unleashing a national conversation about the rights of women. It was one in which Elizabeth and, less willingly, Theophilus took part. Countless times, the couple had warm discussions on the subject. It was Elizabeth, naturally blessed with a most rare command of language, who triumphed in these fights. Yet her victories came at a cost. She felt the demonstration of her intellect prompted jealousy, lest I outshine him. Theophilus was stung to the quick, and his grievances slowly grew. He was the kind of man who counted them like pennies, recording slights in his diary with the miserly accuracy of a rich man unwilling to share his wealth. He grumbled crossly, My wife was unfavourably affected by the tone of society, and zealously espoused almost all new notions and wild vagaries that came along. Perhaps the notion that caused him most consternation, in Elizabeth's words, I, though a woman, have just as good a right to my opinion as my husband has to his. Elizabeth's newfound autonomy was anathema to Theophilus. Wives, obey your husbands became a scriptural passage oft quoted in their home. But Elizabeth was no longer silently listening. Defiantly, she kept on articulating her own thoughts, asserting her own self, inspired by the women's rights movement that it was her right to do so. Theophilus's response was telling. He did not allow his wife agency. He did not encourage her independence. Instead, he wrote that he had sad reason to fear his wife's mind was getting out of order. She was becoming insane on the subject of women's rights. On the morning of June 18th, 1860, Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in bed, her disquiet slowly intensifying. Over the past 4 months, Theophilus had made it plain he wanted her gone. He could not cope with his newly outspoken wife, with her independent mind and her independent spirit, not least because Elizabeth did not keep her new character confined to their home. She asserted herself in public too. In the face of her impassioned eloquence, Theophilus felt powerless and furiously impotent. He conceived a plan. He kept it simple. Just 7 words intended to silence her once and for all. When the Packards next argued, he warned Elizabeth if she did not conform, I shall put you into the asylum. Now you might think, as Elizabeth Packard did, well, what a ridiculous thing to say. Of course he can't send her to an asylum just because she's assertive and she's got a mind of her own. But there you, as Elizabeth was, would be wrong. At the time we're talking about, in the mid-19th century, women who were assertive like Elizabeth, women who had ungovernable personalities or strong resolution, plenty of what is termed nerve, well, these were literally textbook examples of female insanity. And those quotations come from psychiatrists of the era as they define madness in women. And this is the world Elizabeth was in. So as she stood up to her husband and asserted herself, it was seen as madness. It was diagnosed as something called moral insanity. And the definition of that was eccentricity of conduct. Now, you can imagine that a bit like beauty, eccentricity of conduct is in the eye of the beholder. Who is it who defines who is being eccentric? Well, by the terms of mid-19th century psychiatrists, a woman who was assertive or ambitious was just such a case, because the 19th century had these biological-based gender roles, home and children for women, work and intellect for men. And any woman who strove to exist beyond that sphere, who wanted to be more than just a wife, well, she was seen as unfeminine, unnatural, and therefore diseased and essentially sick in the head. And this actually counted against Elizabeth on 2 counts, because she was not only assertive in speaking about what she believed and her own opinion, Elizabeth Packard was an educated woman too. And educated women who studied, women who read, these two were seen as classic examples of female madness. I found a quotation in the research that I did, which came from 1858, 2 years before Elizabeth is lying in bed on that hot summer's morning. And this doctor had gone to visit an all-girls high school, and he remarked to its teachers, "You are training your girls for the lunatic asylum." As Dr. Andrew McFarland, who is the superintendent of the Illinois State Hospital, the doctor to whom Theophilus Packard applies when he wants to send his wife away to an asylum, as McFarland defined it, he said, it was when minds of limited capacity to comprehend subjects tried to do so. Well, this ultimately led to mental breakdown. This is why women who read and studied were seen as liable to go mad, because their brains simply could not cope with the strain of using them. For this reason, I was astonished to find that when I looked up the records from that Illinois State Hospital, the hospital helpfully published biennial reports, which was stuffed full of historical, material for a researcher like me to bring this world to life. Well, these publications that they had, it listed the causes of insanity of the patients who had been locked up alongside Elizabeth. And listed in those documents was a cause, novel reading, which probably applies to all of us on this course. On this call, we probably all like reading novels and certainly reading. But at the time, if you were a woman who engaged in it, this was seen as likely to send you mad. The problem for Elizabeth Packard in that June of 1860 is that it wasn't only the doctors of the time who thought this way. In fact, many people in her community did too. And what happens as Theophilus is getting worried about his outspoken wife, who is starting to assert herself not only on the topic of women's rights, but she's also asserting her own religious beliefs, which are becoming contrary to his. Now, Theophilus is worried about that, and ultimately Elizabeth does choose to leave his church. She goes and worships with the Methodists instead in Manteno. And of course, this is such a public rejection of Theophilus. She's not only rejecting him as her husband, but also as her spiritual leader. And he is, worried about this. He's worried about how it will affect his own standing in the community, but he's also worried about whether any of his parishioners might follow her example. Elizabeth talked a lot of sense, and as I described in that opening chapter, she had a rare command of language. Her friends and compatriots, the people that she knew, described her as having an irresistible magnetism. She was a woman who could be incredibly compelling and persuasive, and Theophilus was worried about her influence. So he told his community that his wife was mad. And what happened is that they then began to view Elizabeth's actions through this prism of madness. And so she was kind of trapped under the microscope. And I think we've seen, we do see all around us, if someone has made that allegation of insanity, well, every person's actions are then judged by that standard. And it's almost like you're looking for the evidence to back up the allegation. And so when Elizabeth shouted at her husband in public because he had not cleaned the yard, well, this was cited as evidence of her madness, because she's an angry woman. What could be more eccentric than a woman who will not be placid and will not be timid, which was the desired view of, feminine women at that time? An angry woman was seen as mad. Similarly, when Elizabeth confided in a friend that she disliked her husband, and no wonder because he's always undermining her, well, that too was seen as madness. Actually, when Theophilus applies to send Elizabeth to the asylum and the doctor assesses her, the doctor actually says her hatred of her husband had something diabolical about it. And this was a reason to incarcerate Elizabeth in the doctor's view, because women were supposed to like their husbands. Another doctor wrote that female insanity was when their love is changed into hate, because women were supposed to love men, and if they rejected that, if they had their own opinion on how a man had treated them and what they thought of it, well, again, this was boxed up in this claim that a woman was crazy. The other thing that struck me about what Elizabeth's fellow parishioners said about her is that they cited her incessant talking as evidence of madness. And I view that claim with a lot of suspicion. And actually, more recent social studies research has found that when people assess how much a woman is talking, they will say, for example, that she's dominating a conversation. And when you actually look at how much that woman might be speaking, scientists have found that actually she might only be speaking 30% of the time. She's not dominating the conversation at all. It's not even an equal share of the conversation. But what is happening is that the people assessing how much a woman is talking are comparing her to the ideal of a silent woman. And I think this is what happened to Elizabeth as well. She is a person who does like to talk, and she does, she does use her voice. But I think in this particular case, that incessant talking needs to be viewed with some suspicion. So Theophilus applies to the asylum, and on a hot summer's night in June 1860, Elizabeth, against her will, is carried to the asylum. Very cleverly, she does not protest physically. She does not lash out at her husband when he comes to take her away. She does not scream. She does not flail. She does not hit out. She realizes that doing so will only add ammunition to his claim that she is crazy. She has to keep herself trapped within an icy fortress of self-composure, because doing anything else will only add weight to his claim that she is mad. But Elizabeth actually is not too worried about being sent away, because she knows she is sane. And even though she's admitted by the doctors and she sleeps that first night in the asylum, hearing the cries of women all around her, protesting against their incarceration, she believes that her stay will be incredibly short. Because even if the doctors keep her, which they do, well, Elizabeth thinks it'll be fine. I will appeal to the law to save me and to give me my liberty. But to Elizabeth's horror, she soon discovers that even the law is on her husband's side. The law said the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. It was a law known as coverture, which had been inherited from the 1110s in England. It seems we Brits have a lot to answer for. And this law essentially gave married women no civic identity at all. Their identities had been subsumed legally within those of their husbands. And it meant married women had no rights to property, no rights to the custody of their children, no right to their own earnings, even to their very liberty. At the time Elizabeth is sent away, on the statute books in Illinois is a law that says husbands could send their wives to asylums by request, and specifically without the evidence of insanity required in other cases. This is what Elizabeth was up against. But I want to make the point that you might think of these laws as historic. Actually, as I researched it, I found that the tendrils and the echoes of them appeared throughout the 20th century too. So, for example, did you know that it wasn't until 1974 that women could get credit cards independently? Before then, a man had to co-sign any credit application, and a woman's earnings would be discounted by as much as 50%. In the UK, where I am from, a woman until 1982 could actually be refused service in a pub if she tried to spend her money there. So this control over women's financial matters, this was still happening long into the 20th century. As Elizabeth is admitted to the hospital, she is shocked to find that many other sane women are all around her. The wards are overcrowded, so much so that Dr. McFarland has actually applied to the Illinois legislature to give him more money to look after all these supposedly insane women. He gets money for a new wing with space to commit another 150 patients, and every single one of them is a woman. Now, this brings to light another angle of 19th century psychiatry, which is that simply being a woman was believed to leave you at increased risk of going mad. Doctors believed that madness was linked to women's sexual organs and their menstrual cycle. So Elizabeth's menstrual cycle, for example, was noted on her admittance form to the asylum. They monitored the women's menstrual cycles too. And it's quite amusing to think of it when you read this. But I actually read in my research that, so dangerous did the doctors think that having a period was, that mothers were actually encouraged to try to delay their daughters' menses, the idea being that this would protect your daughter from potential insanity. The advice that mothers were given to stop their daughters having a period was that their daughters must avoid novels, of course, red meat, feather beds. They should wear drawers and they must take cold shower baths. And this allegedly was the way that daughters could stay out of the asylum that Elizabeth found herself in. Now, all the odds are stacked against Elizabeth. And I'm just going to finish of this, description of the opening of her story by just saying that the way Elizabeth responds to this situation, deprived of liberty, deprived of any recourse to freedom, surrounded by other sane women who have been locked away like her for being unsatisfactory wives, Elizabeth responds to this situation in a truly extraordinary way. She begins the book and the story as a housewife, a woman actually who is content within her domestic sphere, yet she ends it in a completely different place. And what changes her is this crucible of suffering in the asylum and this witnessing of abuse, of injustice. And Elizabeth essentially becomes a stronger woman and a woman who wants to fight for justice through this crucible of suffering. She writes when she's sent away to the asylum, "The worst that my enemies can do, they have done, and I fear them no more. I am now free to be true and honest. No opposition can overcome me." And that is what Elizabeth, keeps as her motto throughout the rest of her life, as she fights to get out of the asylum, as she fights for the rights of women and the mentally ill. She is a woman who could not be silenced. And what I love about this book and her story is actually, it's not only the story of a sane woman sent away to an insane asylum. It's not only the story of the shocking realities of 19th century asylums and, the truth of psychiatry from that time. Above all else, this is the story of a woman learning to find her voice, learning to find that unsilenceable voice. And Elizabeth's journey from housewife to historically significant heroine is one in which I think we can all find inspiration. I certainly find her inspirational. She wrote at the very start of her journey describing a Bible class she went to in 1860. And she's just beginning to assert herself, but it's very early days. And she writes of that class, "I felt so small somehow, as though nothing I said was worth saying or hearing." And that line really resonated with me personally because I know I've been that woman in work meetings in the past, afraid to speak up for my opinion, afraid it'll be shot down or talked over or claimed as someone else's. And to see Elizabeth move from that position to a position where she will fearlessly speak out is something that I personally find really inspiring, and I hope that readers do too. Now, what I want to make really clear is that even though this is a history book, the issues at its heart could not be more modern. And this is actually how I first came to Elizabeth's story. The story for me didn't start on the cusp of the American Civil War in June 1860. It started in the fall of 2017 amid the fire of the Me Too movement. I'm sure you all remember that incredible fall too, where everywhere women were speaking up and speaking out against everyday sexism, against misogyny, sexual harassment, rape. It was an incredibly empowering time, a time where women were seen and heard. What I was really interested in that movement was essentially why had it taken so long and how had it taken so long? And as I was thinking about these issues, my thoughts coalesced around a single realization. For centuries, Whenever women have used our voices, we've been called crazy. Our mental health has been wielded time and again as a weapon against us, used to undermine and control us, so that our passions and even our personalities are seen through this prism of madness, a lens of madness that falls into focus whenever we challenge the powers that be. And I wanted to write about these issues because for me, they are still all around us today. They still resonate so deeply. Just this week, look at what Britney Spears is going through as she appeals against the legal stranglehold that her father has over her. Once again, we have a supposedly crazy woman trying to get out from under the shackles of male control. This is absolutely the story of Elizabeth Packard too. But even before that, you think of any strong political woman, for example, Nancy Pelosi springs to mind. And I'm sure many of you remember that iconic photograph on Twitter of Nancy in an electric blue suit standing up to Trump and an entire table of men. And Trump tweeted after that meeting where Pelosi had literally stood up to him, "There is something wrong with her upstairs. She is a very sick person." Vice President Kamala Harris, when she was announced as as Biden's running mate, she was described as a mad woman. So this language is still all around us. This is still how women are. It's used to try and put women in our place. And so I wanted to write about this, but I am not I am a political writer, but I didn't want to write a polemic. At my heart and what I am passionate about as a writer is storytelling. That's what I think I do best, and that's what I feel passionate about when I'm writing and reading books. I want to be taken on a story. I want to take my readers on a story and through a journey. And so I wanted to explore these issues, but what I wanted to do was to try to find one woman's story through which I could reflect on them, both from history and in the modern day, and sort of see those parallels, the way this happens time and again. A line from the book is "History favors reruns," and almost the very genesis of the book, is encapsulated by that. I was looking for one woman's story from history, and incidentally, I didn't know which period of history I was going to be focusing on. I was just sure that I would find some woman in history, whether it was the 1960s, 50s, 20s, or even the 19th century, as it turned out to be. And so I went looking for Elizabeth, and I fell down a fascinating internet sort of rabbit warren of searches about women and madness. And finally, on the 15th of January 2018, in a University of Wisconsin essay that I randomly found online, I first read about Elizabeth Packard. And the moment I started digging into her story, I knew she was the woman I was going to write about next. Because what a woman she is. Truly inspirational, totally fearless. She takes on the patriarchy, essentially, the received scientific wisdom of the age. She fights husbands, she fights doctors, she fights politicians, she fights everyone who is trying to control her. And she fights against that pernicious claim of insanity, a claim that haunts her for the rest of her life. And yet she is defiant, and she, is so totally, she has such faith in herself. And that is inspirational too, that she believes in herself to such a degree that she keeps on fighting regardless. And she went on to achieve remarkable things. I talked about her being a historically significant heroine. She changes the world. She, changes the laws to make things better for women and the mentally ill. She makes the world a better place. So truly extraordinary woman. But also, what a story she has. As a storyteller, she was, this was a gift as I found her, because her story has everything in it. It's got an empowering fight for justice. It's got a compelling heroine. It has dastardly villains. It's got a twist of gothic horror as I take you inside the insane asylums of the 19th century. It's got a courtroom drama as Elizabeth finally secures a trial to prove her sanity or otherwise. And so all these twists and turns are just such a gift for me as a writer. But as soon as I started looking into researching the book, I realized I was going to be up against it, because there is no Elizabeth Packard special collection where I could go and look her up, which is astonishing to me because she was so integral to the reform movement of the 19th century. There is no memorial to Elizabeth Packard, yet there is a mental health centre named after the psychiatrist who kept her incarcerated. But what I did find as I began my research were Elizabeth's own books, because I talked about her earlier, finding that unsilenceable voice. Well, she becomes a writer. She becomes a writer in the asylum. She's forbidden to write, but she determines to keep a secret journal, recording how she's feeling, everything that's happening in the asylum. She steals scraps of fabric to record it on. She tears out the margins of newspapers and scribbles on that, blank space, any space that she can find to recall what's happening. And I've been able to draw on that journal and the books that she also wrote, so that you will hear from Elizabeth in the book her first person account of what it's like to be a sane woman locked up in an insane asylum. A truly extraordinary writer herself. It's such a gift to be able to quote her liberally throughout the book. But I didn't just want to focus on Elizabeth's words. And what was amazing was I also found the writings of my antagonists. I've got her husband's diary in there so that I can put his side of the story. I've got the writings of her doctor so that you truly hear from all the main players in the book. Now, of course, I really wanted to bring this world to life too. So my research was also about delving into the treatments, the drugs, the realities of what being inside an insane asylum was like at that time. And that was something I was personally fascinated by. Books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, The Bell Jar, The Yellow Wallpaper, all of this had inspired me and, fed into me wanting to write this book. And it was fascinating for me to find the historical sources that allow me to bring the asylum to life. Not just physical descriptions of the furniture that was around them, the straitjackets that the women were wearing. And just as a side note on that, I was shocked to read in the asylum's own reports that they made the patients work without pay. And one of the things that they made the women in the sewing room do was make their own restraining jackets. That to me was incredibly shocking. So this was a wonderful part of my research for the book as well, unearthing these realities of what things were like. Perhaps the most shocking thing I discovered was about the treatments, however. I talked about how women's bodies were seen as a cause of insanity, and so doctors' treatments focused on these too. Perhaps the most shocking treatment for insanity that I read about was something called a clitoridectomy. It was literally female genital mutilation. They would cut off women's clitorises if they thought that they were mad. And as I've described, madness was not madness at all. The doctor's case notes for these operations included a 20-year-old patient who had been, deemed mad because she liked to engage in serious reading. There was a 30-year-old woman who was operated on because she'd expressed dislike for the society of her husband. And these operations, to my horror, actually stretched well past the 19th century. Records show that in the Western world, operations to correct emotional disorder continued until the 1940s. The last recorded case was on a 5-year-old girl. As I read about these things, my passion for this story only grew, and my passion led me on a physical research trip in America, and it led me to follow in Elizabeth's own footsteps. I travelled all over America. The two things I just want to talk about to you in this presentation was one, I went to actually attend a Sunday service at the church where her husband had preached. It is a small whitewash building in Manteno, Illinois. It has dark wood-beamed ceiling. And it was so insightful for me to go there and to worship with the congregation, because as our bodies rose and fell in unison, as our voices rose and fell, as we sang and prayed and spoke the words aloud, I realized what Elizabeth had to break away from, that sense of community and cohesion, to strike out on your own from that is really quite remarkable. A brilliant coda about my research trip to the church was that it now has a female pastor. And I just thought that was wonderful. The final and perhaps most powerful part of my research, though, was going to visit the hospital in which Elizabeth had been held. Like her, I walked past the stone gateposts that mark the border of the asylum grounds. They're, of course, very old now. The stone is crumbling, and they're twice the height of a woman. And there is a very real sense of crossing over as you leave the roar of civilization behind you and move into what is now a community park. I remembered from Elizabeth's own writings that she talked about this infant orchard. Well, that orchard was now grown to maturity, and the trees were so many and so verdant that when the wind whispered through them, it sounded like a chorus of voices trying to be heard. The buildings are now abandoned. I met teenagers, actually, well, not teenagers, I met people, locals in the local library who, when they were teenagers, they used to break into the abandoned hospital and traverse those long corridors by flashlight, trying to find out the secrets of the insane asylum. Those secrets were actually recorded on its windowsills. They had limestone windowsills, and the patients used to etch messages into the sills. To my absolute disappointment, though many auxiliary buildings still stood, the hospital that Elizabeth had been in was demolished in 1984, so I was too late to see it. Yet this site still has secrets that it can tell us, because in 1988 they discovered a tranche of unmarked graves. The patients were always buried in unmarked graves, and they suddenly discovered a whole new tranche of them only a few years after the building was knocked down. The auxiliary buildings were still standing, and so as part of my research trip, I did peer through the windows of these abandoned buildings. It was really haunting to glimpse inside the way that the unpeeling paint unfurled from the underside of staircases, looking like underwater seaweed or a drowning woman's hair. I glimpsed orphan furniture, a desk, a chair, a hat stand with no hats. What I really noted, however, as I was looking around, was that these buildings were graffitied. Don't open, dead inside. But I think it is important to open the doors to the past, because through them step people like Elizabeth Packard, with her spirit as wide as her cage crinoline skirt. And for me, Elizabeth's greatest legacy is the example she sets for us. She wrote, "Women are made to fly and soar, not to creep and crawl as the haters of our sex want us to." And I think Elizabeth's greatest legacy is that she teaches us all how to fly, how to become people who cannot be silenced. She wrote, "I will not set my light under a bushel. I will set it upon a candlestick, that it may give light to others." And I think Elizabeth Packard's light still shines through the centuries. It shines for all of us about what can happen if you believe in yourself, if you speak up for what you believe in. And I think her extraordinary legacy is that she is the woman they could not silence, and we can still hear her today and be inspired by the legacy she has left. Thank you.
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have some wonderful questions that have come in. I'll start with one from Suzanne. That was from our live chat. Did Elizabeth have family like siblings or parents other than her young children that would have been able to help her?
Yeah, that's a great question. She had two brothers and she had a father who was around at the time of the committal, but they chose to believe her husband. It wasn't helped by the fact that they were geographically very different. So Elizabeth was living in Illinois at that time, and her family were in Massachusetts. She hadn't actually seen her father for 10 years because the Packards had moved west. And obviously in those times, it wasn't that easy to travel, across the states to get home again. So Theophilus wrote to her father and said that Elizabeth was mad, and her father took her husband at his word. He actually sent money to pay for Elizabeth's psychiatric care. Elizabeth actually was a ward of the state, so Theophilus apparently pocketed the money. But yeah, so they would have been able to help her to a degree. Obviously, she was essentially the property of her husband, so he could do what he wanted with her. But actually, her father and brothers supported her husband until Elizabeth actually manages to see them again. And as soon as they see her in person, they realize it's all been a pack of lies. And actually, her father issues her with a statement, a signed legal statement saying, there's been absolutely no reason to believe my daughter is insane. Her husband has been awful to her, essentially. This is my true belief, because obviously Theophilus would use it that Elizabeth's own father, supported her committal, to say, I wasn't doing a bad thing. This wasn't cruel conduct. And so Samuel, Ware, Elizabeth's father, he feels he has to issue this legal document in order to combat what Theophilus continues to say.
Oh my goodness. Okay, how did you first hear about Elizabeth?
So as I say, it was me digging through this internet search, looking for a sane woman from history who'd, been declared insane by a patriarchal society for speaking her mind. And that's who I went looking for. And, my research was fascinating, just trying to find her. But a lot of the stories that I was uncovering, particularly from later, by which time there were lobotomies happening, there were electric shock therapies happening, none of those women had what I was looking for, which was hopefully a sort of triumphant ending and a happy ending for my book. Those stories just ended with the women literally being silenced, often being left dumb or mute or, brain damaged from the treatments that had been happening. So Elizabeth was extraordinary, not only because she wrote and I could draw on her writing so that I knew exactly what she was feeling, which obviously was such a gift, particularly because it's a book that's set 160 years ago. It would have been impossible to write the kind of intimate narrative that I have written had Elizabeth not left that record behind. But also her story does have, this positive inspirational slant as well. So I'm not just looking at the system, as it were, the system that silences women. I'm also looking at how to fight against it and win.
Okay, our next question is from Amy. I found the Radium Girls fascinating and look forward to reading this book. How do you find these women's subjects, and do you have others in mind for future books?
My discovery of the Radium Girls was just so serendipitous. I wasn't looking for the next book I was going to write. I was actually looking for the next play I wanted to direct. At that time, that's how the Radium Girls came about. I Googled great plays for women because as a female director, I wanted to stage a play with great roles for my actresses. And one of the plays that came back was about the Radium Girls. And then from staging my production, I realized there was no book about the women, no history book about them that celebrated their legacy. And I decided to write it. That's how that book came about. Elizabeth, as I said, was almost topsy-turvy. I went looking specifically for her. I had the idea first and then went to find a figure in history who would allow me to write about the subjects. Both of them, funnily enough, were found essentially through the internet. So I'm a very lucky writer to be writing in this technologically advanced time that will allow me, from the comfort of my sofa, to go and find these incredible women who've not been written about widely, but I can find enough about them online to know that they will be my next subjects. In terms of what I want to write next, I do have some ideas. I'm not sure which idea is going to rise to the surface first, or even if it will be any of the ideas that I've currently got, or I might stumble on something new. I'm beginning to think about what I'm going to be doing next. I'm obviously in the sort of whirlwind of publishing The Woman They Could Not Silence at the moment, but that will die down soon, and then I shall need to knuckle down and really decide upon the subject and then begin the research.
Was it challenging to find sources for this book as this all happened so long ago?
Um, there were certain challenges. I would say for me, one of the most sort of disappointing elements of the research was reaching out to Elizabeth's family. And anyone who's read the Radium Girls will know that a key part of the research for that book was interviewing family members of the Radium Girls. You know, I spoke to sons and daughters, nieces and nephews, sisters of the women. And of course, because that's such a close relationship, you know, both biologically and the passage of time, they were really able to bring the women to life for me, you know, talk to me about their hobbies, their passions, the sounds of their voices. You know, they really could conjure the women for me. And one of the first things I did when I decided I want to write about Elizabeth Packard was I tracked her family down and asked for an interview, and they very kindly granted me one. But because it was 160 years ago, I'm speaking to great great granddaughters, and they really can't illuminate me anymore on Elizabeth in a way. It was the contrast. I was, you know, able to unearth things in my research that perhaps they hadn't known. One thing I did love about my interviews with the families, though, was her great great granddaughter told me that she still has the original editions of Elizabeth's books, which are signed, and she keeps them on her mantelpiece. And she said, anytime there's a major family celebration, or, you know, a sort of key moment in their lives, for example, the prom pictures of her children, she said she always took them with the books on the mantelpiece in the background, so that Elizabeth Packard was, you know, the matriarch of this family, was still part of the celebrations. And I thought that was wonderful.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. And our last question, how long did it take you from deciding to write about Elizabeth to researching the details to finish the book?
I made a note of dates for this one because I was often asked about it on Radium Girls, and I thought this time I'm going to make a note. So I first discovered her name on the 15th of January 2018, and I delivered the book, my first draft manuscript, which was too long, so I then had to spend months editing it down. Delivered that first draft 4th of March 2020, just before the pandemic hit. So it was about two and a bit years of intensive research and writing. I'm the kind of writer, I do all my research first, and then I write in a sort of, again, a whirlwind, a blitz. You know, it doesn't take me relatively long to write, but I've poured my heart and soul and head into all the research and categorizing it so that when I come to write, I know everything about the scene that I'm creating, and it can just pour out of me as I say. I hope readers read as quickly as I write. I hope you sort of, one of my readers said, it goes down like a glass of water, she said. And I hope that that's what readers experience too, that they can slake their thirst and, you know, keep on drinking and keep those pages turning. That was the kind of book I wanted to write.
Well, I know I can speak for everyone watching here and saying thank you for writing these wonderful books about these incredible women.
It's a total honor, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you all this evening, and for all the work you do, you know, in sharing these stories as well as booksellers. You know, we'd be nowhere without you, so thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And to everyone watching, we do still have some limited edition journals that we were able to get our hands on. So if you purchase a copy of this book from the Doylestown or Lahaska Bookshop, you can click the button on your screen to do that. You should be able to receive one of those journals. They're very beautiful. They have the cover art of the book on the front. They're really, really interesting journals.
I have to say they're absolutely stunning. They're filled with inspirational quotes from Elizabeth, and this, as I say, she's a brilliant writer. They're amazing quotes. I haven't actually seen one of the journals yet. I've seen it via a screen, but I haven't yet got my hands on one. But it looks beautiful on the PDF, and I can't wait to hold one.
They're gorgeous. They're gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. Well, thank you so much for staying up past midnight to talk with us.
My pleasure.
Good luck on the rest of your virtual tour. I hope for your next book that we'll be able to see you again in Pennsylvania.
I really hope so. Thank you so much for your support, and to everyone for coming. Thank you so much for listening.
Of course. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and have a good night.